Radio. This is achieveradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/achieveradio.
I'm Anne-Marie, and you are listening to Achieve Spiritual Holistic Radio TV. Today, I was intrigued with a message that came into my email about a book series, and a woman named April, who is April Bennett, who is also a suffragist and has a book called I Ask the Suffragists, and she also has a religious feminist podcast, which I was listening to and fascinated with. It was all about liberated Muslim women and liberated women in general. And, I really loved what I was listening to. I think no matter what kind of light worker you are, the journey of women and the journey of women leaders and the journey of women holistic, compassionate, heartfelt speakers, whether a mother or whether a minister or a priestess, whatever that is, the story is always started by mothers and women. And the rest kind of gets into place with men. But I think that today I want to take it over, and today we're going to go to April Young Bennett. Hello, April.
Hello.
How are you today?
I am feeling just fine.
What can you tell me about your perception? How do young children, and kind of go along with me here, how do young children first begin to find compassion, the heartfelt message that they hopefully will live on in their entire lives? How much does the message of mothers and women, do you feel, begins this journey?
I think the beginning of the journey is innate in all of us. I am part of a very patriarchal religious tradition. I love it in many ways, but of course it does have many problems in the way that it treats women inequitably. And sometimes my patriarchal religious leaders will kind of fret about who I caught this from, like it's a contagion, like maybe somebody passed it to me, like they gave me some bad ideas and got me thinking about things that I shouldn't have been thinking about. It's not like that at all. I think the need for inequity is innate, and it just comes from within, and it just naturally exists within all of us. So you don't even need to spread the message in the sense of you don't need to recruit people to the cause, because people just feel the drive for equality and they feel motivated to become more equitable.
So going back to the question, what is the mother, what is the feminist voice in beginning the journey of, and I understand what you're saying about the patriarchal journey as far as organized religion or things like that, but where does it all begin? I mean, do you feel that women, the voice of the mother, the voice to her children, begins that journey of compassion and of teachings of God and do you feel that it starts that way? Because to me, it does.
Yeah. Within my religious tradition, we talk about a heavenly mother. Unfortunately, we don't talk about her enough. we talk more about the masculine deity. But
Yes.
I do believe in a heavenly mother, and I believe that she does speak to us and motivate us and inspire us, especially inspire us.
Right. And do you feel that that's where mothers come into the picture with their children? I mean, beyond what you're worshiping, the voice of the woman, the voice of the mother. Do you feel that there is that, even beyond the deity, the voice of the mother and the voice of her heartfelt message begins that journey with her children?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like an inner light.
Right. So that's what I feel like. The woman begins the inner light, the mother. And so that is just where I wanted to begin. Now, you say in your book, um, and you have a religious feminist podcast, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
You bet. I've been an activist, a feminist activist, for many years, and I've been working in many causes, but especially within my own religious community, which is quite patriarchal. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. People often refer to us as Mormons. And it is a very patriarchal religious tradition, and I've been working on feminist causes within it. And we worked so hard all the time. We were brainstorming constantly. We talked to each other on social media. It would be like a rolling meeting that would just go on forever because we would be brainstorming and getting ideas and recruiting people for actions and activism and just talking with each other constantly. And while this was all great and wonderful, I began to feel like certainly other people have already tried this, have already had some experiences like this, and we could learn a little bit more from each other. We could learn a little bit more from the past. And so that's the reason I started the Religious Feminism podcast, because I wanted to meet some other people who are working for equity within other religious faiths. Maybe they didn't have the same theology, but it's still, they had the same goals, they had the same purpose, and I felt like there's probably a lot I can learn from them. And so I began that podcast so I could meet these people and talk to them. We could share ideas.
And what is the name of that podcast?
The Religious Feminism Podcast.
Oh, okay. The Religious Feminism Podcast. That is bound to get good search engine openness there. Well,
yes, more easy to find than creative, but I wanted people to be able to find us.
Right. So are you, in your past blog post I saw, is it all right to talk about that?
Sure, yeah.
You were saying something about contending as a woman priestess or woman, however you say that, that it is hard to be able to sometimes do and minister as you would like without having to contend with some of the male voices that were dominating the church. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. In my church, we have what we call the priesthood, and we do talk about priestesses within my religious tradition as well, especially within our temple ceremonies. However, when it comes to administering the church, only men are ordained to the priesthood that administers the church, and only men are basically in charge of the theology, in charge of the activities we do, the charity work we do. Men are at the head of all of that, and women are below them. And also another interesting thing about our faith is that within our faith, every male person is ordained to this priesthood at the age of 12. And every woman is not.
Really?
Yes. So it creates a hierarchy where every male person within our faith is higher in the hierarchy than every woman.
What is the history of the Mormon Church?
The Mormon Church began with Joseph Smith in the 1830s and 40s, and at that time he was in New York. And they kind of were trying to establish Zion. They weren't the only ones at the time. There were other religious communities that were doing similar things, where they were gathering and establishing sort of what they called a Zion community. In the case of our church, that Zion community ended up moving and moving until it eventually kind of landed in Salt Lake City, Utah, which wasn't called that at the time, but is now today. And that's where it was for quite a while. And in some ways, there's a lot of feminist theology within it. Like I said, we believe in a heavenly mother, that God is male and female. And one thing that
so that's kind of liberated, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That definitely is. And then another thing with our church is that at that time, most Christian churches weren't allowing women to preach and to preach from the pulpit and to give sermons. And our faith was and still does allow that. And so that was another way in which women were liberated. However, there were some other things that were very much the opposite. I already mentioned that every male person is ordained to the priesthood and women are not, although within the temple we do talk about priestesses as well. And another really frightening thing that happened in the past was there was an experiment with polygamy where men were marrying multiple women, and so a man would be allowed to have many different wives. A harem, basically. And fortunately, it's been over 100 years since that's been going on, but it's still sort of a ghost that haunts us.
And so it's not going on now?
No, not today. Not within the main branches of the faith. I mean, there are still a few splinter groups that do that, but it's not within the main faction, definitely not within the faith community that I'm in.
Okay. So you mentioned that women priestess were a part of the history, right?
Yeah, and our current practice. We have ceremonies.
What status does a woman priestess have?
That's ironic. They have little to none. It's sort of something that we go into. We have ceremonies. We have some ceremonies that take place in our public churches where anyone can watch and participate, or rather they can watch. They can participate in some ways and not in others. And then we have other ceremonies that are performed within temples that you have to be a member in good standing to participate in. In those public ceremonies that take places in churches, women are not allowed to do any ordinance work whatsoever. We can participate by receiving the ordinances. For example, when they pass the communion, we can take the communion, but we can't bless it, we can't pass it, we can't administer it in any way. Within the temple, it's a little bit different. Within the temple, women are performing priestly roles, and for some reason, it's only done behind closed doors in the temple, and it doesn't translate into the rest of our church life. So even though women are performing ordinances within these private temple ceremonies, once they leave temple doors, they're back to being lower status than the men and not having those kinds of opportunities to actually communicate with God by giving blessings and performing ordinances outside those temple doors.
You mentioned in your blog that you had a scuffle. What was that scuffle about?
Yeah, one thing that we do inside those temples is that's where our wedding ceremonies take place. And because our wedding ceremonies are within these temples, men have the right to decide who is allowed to enter. They have to be within a certain position, such as a bishop or a stake president. A stake president is basically, it's another clergy role over a bishop. So men, who are the only ones allowed to occupy these positions, have to give you permission to attend a wedding inside one of these temples. And at the time that my brother was about to get married, I was heavily involved in feminist activism. I was one of the organizers of a group called Ordained Women, and we were advocating for women to be ordained to the priesthood on an equal basis with men so that we could fully participate in our faith just as men do. And my local ecclesiastical leader, he threatened to bar me from my own brother's wedding ceremony if I did not give up my leadership position in this organization.
Oh, no. And what did you do?
You know, this was a difficult time, and I made a kind of a controversial decision. There were actually two things that, well, originally there was a long list of demands he had for me, and over a course of about 2 months' time, while we were preparing for this wedding, I was negotiating with him about these demands he was making and trying to make it work so that I could maintain my integrity and the things that I am committed to and believe in, but also be there for my family. And he eventually whittled it down to two demands, and one of them was that I stepped down from this leadership position I had within Ordained Women, and the other was that I censor certain blog posts I had written that talk about the need for women to hold the priesthood on an equal basis with men. And so I decided in the end that while...
Your brother was more important.
Well, I'd not exactly know, because I really believe, and I still believe, that my work within Ordained Women was very, very important, and that my writing about the need to ordain women was very important. But I also felt like other women were equally competent to perform that work, that if I stepped down, that there were many other women qualified to take my place who would hold that leadership role during that temporary time when I needed to step down. I agreed to step down for a 2-year period, not forever. And I felt that these other women, they were ready, and that they could handle that authority, and that they could take on that position, and that I could keep on working within the cause. It's just that I wouldn't be, in a leadership role. I would still be there, though, working hard for the things I believed in. And when it came to censoring that writing, I know my history, and I know that whenever you censor something, all it does is it makes people curious about it, and then more people read it. In the case of a blog post on the internet, while some of those blog posts did attract a lot of attention, it was temporary attention. Everything on the internet attracts attention for a while, and then people lose interest and move on to other things that are more exciting at the moment. So although many of these blog posts had been influential and had a lot of readers at the time they were newer, by that time they were quite old, and I let him censor them and take them down, all it's going to do is attract new readers to find them. And they did. Mm-hmm. As soon as I took them down, people were combing internet archives, and they were finding copies of my writing and passing it around, and all of a sudden there were things I had written years before that people had stopped reading a long time ago that they were reading again. So,
oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
So tell me about your book. Tell me about the book.
So my book is called Ask a Suffragist, Stories and Wisdom from America's First Feminists. And the reason I wrote it is because, like I just said, here's one example of something I learned from the past that really affected my activism today. Based on the things that I knew about what had happened with censorship in the past, for example, at the time women were fighting for the right to vote, I knew I had a pretty good idea that if somebody censored me, this is what the results would most likely be. And so there's so many lessons that we can learn from our past, and that was another way that I wanted to make the work better and smarter for all of us. One of the ways I mentioned before was by the Religious Feminism podcast, where I was speaking to other women who are working within other faith communities and sharing ideas with each other. Another way I wanted to do that was by looking back to the women who had already fought for so many of the rights that we have today, and see how they handled it, how they made it work, and find out if there were any tips I could glean from them.
One of the things that I thought was interesting was you said something in one of the questions about how did women of color change the movement for women's activism? How did that happen? In what way did they affect that?
Women of color actually started the movement to begin with. The very first woman in my book is Maria W. Stewart, and she was a woman of color, and she was, at that time, there was a taboo against women speaking in public in front of men. The belief was that, and it was a pretty prevalent belief among Christians particularly, and among many different Christian faiths, that while it was appropriate for a man to stand up and give a speech to whomever he pleased and to share his views with them, that wasn't a ladylike thing for a woman to do, and it wasn't appropriate for women to do. So it was okay for a woman to share her opinions with other women, but it was not okay for her to give a speech out in public in front of men. Women were not to speak to men in that way. And this was a very prevalent belief, and they enforced it. Whenever a woman did try to speak out in public, they would throw things at her. One of the things I talk about is they use scripture against her, not just by quoting it, but also by throwing them at the scriptures at the woman.
Throwing the scripture at her.
Yes, literally.
Wow.
Banging at her with Bibles.
Whoa.
They enforced it pretty well. And the very first woman to actually say, okay, I'm not going to put up with this. I am going to give a speech. I'm going to advertise it. It's going to be a public speech. Men and women are invited because I want men to hear what I have to say, was Maria Stewart, who was a woman of color. And she was the first one to do this. It was not received well.
I can imagine.
People were pretty upset about it. But she did it for quite some time, for about 3 years, before she just had enough. And she took a break. But she started something. She got the ball rolling. And then she inspired other women to begin following in her footsteps. And some of those women, actually many of those women, were black abolitionist women who were fighting for women of their race to be free. And especially within the Fortin and Purvis family in Pennsylvania, those were some women who were very active in this movement. And they found that if they wanted to abolish slavery and they wanted to achieve that goal that they had, they needed to fight for women's rights first, because they couldn't do anything if men wouldn't allow them to, say, give a speech or write a petition or talk to the legislature. They had to get through these barriers and fight for women's rights so they could fight for the other causes they also cared about.
How did the Mormon feel about slavery? Where did they come in on that?
Most Mormons were Northerners and were not slaveholders. There were a minority who were, but for the most part, there weren't that many.
Okay.
So they didn't take a firm stand against it, because they did allow some people to hold slaves, but most of them were Northerners and did not do that.
So one of the things you said is, what is a man's role in a feminist movement? Is there what is their role in it?
When I look back in history, I mentioned that it began with black women, but some of the people that followed immediately afterwards were men. And some of the earliest feminists in America were men. Men like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and Samuel May. These men, they very much cared about abolishing slavery, and they noticed the same thing. They noticed that if they wanted to abolish slavery, they couldn't do it alone. They needed women. Women were passionate about the cause. They were willing to work. They were strong and competent, and they wanted to have them on their side. So these men fought for women to have those rights so they could participate with them in the abolition movement. Now, when I say that, I should say some of them did. Some other male abolitionists were the ones who were keeping women down in the first place, who didn't want women to be involved, wanted them to stay at home while they did
no matter what color. Yeah.
Yeah. So there were definitely both happening. There were some, as you look at history over time, there definitely were different opinions about what men's role in the movement should be. Some women, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, over time got really fed up with men and started feeling like, women need to do this ourselves, because these men, they bully us, they take over, and they don't share our priorities.
Even the ones that help out.
She was fed up even with the ones that help out. So there were some people who felt that way. However, for me personally, when I look at the history, I just think there are so many milestones that women couldn't have accomplished alone. We really need everyone. And so I'm really grateful for men who participate in the feminist movement.
So is religion compatible with a feminist movement? I have always wondered with my, one of the things that is obvious about the Bible is that no matter who the woman was, like you're saying about the Mormon church, women had a place beneath men. And it's that way, even though there were very incredibly strong biblical women, there is a sense that the Bible is a history of downtrodden women getting stoned and things like that, and how does a religion compatible with the feminist movement?
I work with a lot of religious feminists, and a lot of them are feminists because of their faith. And there's two different reasons for that. One is because their faith inspires them and makes them feel like, well, first of all, it gives them the desire to change the world and make the world a better place. It helps them to learn to care about right versus wrong and to feel the desire to be on the side of right and to make things right. So there's many ways that religion is very inspiring to women. And if you look at history, that's true too. There are women like Sojourner Truth is one who comes to mind, who is a very religious woman. And I think it was because of this, well, she says so. She says so in her memoir, that the reason she felt so inspired to fight for women's rights and to fight for abolition was because of her faith. Her faith gave her that feeling that she needed to do something, and it gave her the confidence to do it. That said, another reason why religious women are often feminists is because we encounter patriarchy firsthand in our lives in ways that people who aren't religious maybe don't. Our religious communities tend to be exempt from those discrimination laws that moderate many other sectors of society, and so there's a lot of things that you'll see within religious communities that just don't exist elsewhere. Like the idea of having an all-male clergy. I mean, you couldn't go to it. Most businesses couldn't say, okay, we're only going to promote the men. That would be illegal. So you'll still see some of those things there, and women and all people have this innate need to be equitable and to be treated fairly. And so that leads many women to feel the desire to become feminists and to become activists because they see patriarchy in action, and it makes them want to make a change. And so for those two different reasons, there's so many strong feminists within religious traditions. And if you look at history, that's the case as well.
I've always noticed in the churches that I went to is how many more women there were than men that often attended. I wonder if giving men the hierarchy encourages more men to attend in a way, because I think in the Lutheran church that I went to, and I've noticed this in many churches, the men are sleeping, the men are just not there, and the women are very much there. So I'm wondering, does it work for men in a church setting to be able to be so powerful? Does it make sure that men are there and attending, and by giving them that control?
That is a thing that I hear often as a religious feminist. People who oppose the kind of changes that I seek will say that. They'll say, well, that wouldn't be good for men because then men would just sit there and be lazy and have nothing to do and let the women do all the work. Men need to be in a leadership role over women, or they will just sit on their butts. Basically, that's the argument. There's two things that I think I usually say to people about that. The first is that the God I believe in does not care more about lazy men than about women. So I don't believe that any God that I would be willing to worship would actually choose to protect lazy men and protect their laziness rather than to give women spiritual opportunities. So that's the first thing and probably the most important. Another is that it's kind of a hypothetical situation that we don't really see. Because if you look at those traditions, and there are many now, fortunately, if you look at those traditions that do ordain women and allow women to join their clergy just as they do men, within most of those traditions, the vast majority of clergymen are still male. Even though women are allowed to be clergy, the vast majority are still male. And so it's just not, it's a false premise that if women are allowed to join the priesthood, all of a sudden the men disappear. That isn't what's happened in any faith that's actually done that.
I see. Okay. But I don't think the Muslim church is about to go out of their way to make a women in charge of the priesthood, do you feel? I mean, from listening to your podcast about the Muslim women that were learning how or beginning to claim their rights and things, I thought, what a journey they must have. But also in the church, it must be very difficult for them. They must be constantly slammed and criticized.
No, I don't think that's going to happen in their faith or in mine either anytime soon. Activism is a long-term project. When I look at the history of, for example, the suffrage movement, like my book is about, the suffrage movement, we often think about, okay, there was Seneca Falls where they said women should vote, and then after that, they had some parades, and then they passed the 19th Amendment. Well, in between those parades and the 19th Amendment and the Seneca Falls Convention was about 100 years. And we kind of skipped that part.
Yeah, we did kind of skip that in the history books, didn't we?
We did. So this was a long-term project with women claiming their power and passing on these traditions of activism and protest to their daughters and to their granddaughters. And this went on for a while. And so I anticipate that many of the movements we care about today will also be long-term projects. But also one thing I know about activists is that an activist is an optimist. Because nobody is willing to do this exhausting work in which many people will become angry with you and annoyed with you, and you will encounter opposition if they don't believe that in the end it's all possible. And so we're just a bunch of optimists who believe that we can make a change, although the more realistic of us know it's going to be a long-term project, and it'll take a while.
Oh, I imagine. Does art inspire change?
I love that question. When we look at history, how art has motivated the movement is so interesting. One of those women of color, in fact, she's the one on the cover of my book, was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And she was a poet, and she wrote fiction. And her poetry especially was kind of fun because she used to take her poetry out onto the streets and she would perform her poetry. Her poetry wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be performed. Sort of like slam poets today, right? Where she would go out and she would entertain the masses by reciting her poetry in a theatrical way. It would get everyone listening, and they would be so busy being entertained that they would let her say things to them within her poetry that they might not put up with in a regular conversation.
Right, right, because it was art, right.
It was art. It was to be listened to. It was something to pay attention to and think about. And she was one of the early people to do that. Activists still do that today. There are so many ways we use art within our movements. One recent example was the Women's March on Washington. So many women made those hand-knit pussy hats and wore them to this movement, so you could see this color everywhere. We may not think of that as fine art, and it isn't, but it is a way to use the expression of art, to use artistic expression to express your beliefs and to make yourself heard in a different kind of a way.
Right. And it's more accepted, like you say, because it is under the definition of art.
Right.
So how do you define your priorities? How do women define their priorities of following in a way that is in brotherhood with mankind and still be shouting their message for passionate liberation of their beliefs? How do they define their priorities?
There's a few things that I've learned from the people in history. One of them is that if we really care about women as women's rights advocates, we must care about ourselves. And so what we want has value, and our needs have value. And being an activist is actually very rewarding work. It can be frustrating and it can be tiring, but it's also very rewarding. There's something innately valuable about the feeling that you're making a difference in the world. That said, at times, as people who care about women and believe in women, sometimes we have to say, okay, maybe this isn't the most feminist choice, right, that for me right now, but this is what I need to do to make myself happy right now. Or maybe this isn't the best thing I could do for the cause, but there are other people who can step in right now, and I need to step back just for a bit for me because I matter as a person. So that's one of the things that can be done. Another is to look at what really matters. It's not always about whether you're right or not. One example from history is when it comes to the dress reform campaign. Many suffragists got involved in dress reform. They believed that women should be allowed to wear pants. I'm with them on that. Of course we should be allowed to wear pants. But ironically, at that time, women were not given the opportunity to wear pants. They were expected to wear long dresses, petticoats, corsets. Their attire was completely impractical and in some ways dangerous because they did a lot of work with fire, working around the hearth, carrying candles around. And these gigantic skirts, they could catch on fire. So they were absolutely right that women should be allowed to wear pants like men. That said, as they started wearing pants, they didn't call them this, but people who made fun of them started calling them bloomers. So as they started wearing bloomers, they ran into so much street harassment everywhere they went, and it was an ongoing, exhausting problem. These women, they knew that they were going to encounter opposition when they stepped onto the platform and gave a speech. They knew there would be hecklers, people throwing objects at them, all sorts of chaos surrounding them. But then, after it was all over, they would step back, go back home, regroup, and get ready for the next battle. But when they were wearing bloomers, the battles never ended. Because everywhere they went, people recognized them by their clothing and knew that they were that was a suffragist. They could tell because she was wearing bloomers, and they would start attacking her on the street. Everywhere they had no space, they had no time. They were constantly having to be at war, never having any personal time at all. And they found that it became more and more difficult to talk about other issues they cared about, such as suffrage, such as abolition of slavery, such as combating alcoholism. These were some things they cared about very much. But when they tried to speak about those subjects, all the audience would care about was their clothes. Yeah. And they couldn't get the word across. So sometimes, even when you're right about something, you've got to say, okay, even though I'm right about this thing, is it as important as this other thing I also care about? And that's what the suffragists did in the end. They said, even though we're right about pants and we should be allowed to wear pants, we're going to put on some long dresses so that we can talk about the other causes we believe in. The message comes through
and not the statement of how you dress.
Right.
One of the things that I noticed in I think it was somewhere in the book description was about the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
Can you describe to me what the Me Too movement really is about?
The Me Too movement is an opportunity for women everywhere to make themselves heard about something that was taboo before, and that is sexual harassment in the workplace. For a very, very long time in many different sectors of society, we've heard about it a lot in the news within the tech sector, within the entertainment sector, although it happens in many sectors. Within politics, we've also heard about it in the news. There's been a certain tolerance for sexual harassment in the workplace that has gone on for a long time. And that tolerance has been aided by a taboo against talking about it, about how it's not nice to accuse men of sexual harassment, and how women should just put up with it and not bother anyone about it. So with the Me Too movement, women are saying, there's no reason we should put up with this, and we are going to speak out and say, this has happened to me too. And there have been many, many voices coming up and saying, this is happening, this has happened to me personally, and this isn't okay anymore. We're not going to put up with this anymore.
How do you feel about some of the men that go way back in the, 50s and 60s being accused of modern concepts about that? I mean, now Bill Cosby aside, because we realized there was much more to it than just behind the scenes touching, you know. I mean, you know what I'm saying. But I mean, a lot of these guys, it isn't so much, I don't hear about it so much now, but it was kind of like the pantaloons when it was at its most intense. There were a lot of men that were from a completely different era of values suddenly being extinguished like a whoosh out of their jobs and stuff for the modern women's concept of Me Too. Do you feel that perhaps that went into the pantaloon uh, philosophy, you know, where it began to be such a high priority to stand up for that not to happen, that maybe what we mean by that is it cannot happen now. It cannot happen realizing that it was not acceptable at a time of different values. Is it the duty of women to extinguish men that were of a different time and a different value system?
Every case is different. I know that there are some cases where you can argue whether it was justified or not to fire those men. One thing you can't change is the women who were not promoted, women who were fired by some of these men because they didn't do what they wanted them to. That's already happened. It happened a long time ago. So it's really hard to evaluate. Like, you can't really say one standard of this is the right decision. I mean, that's why these are different crimes committed by different people at different times, and they can only be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But I do think the movement itself is valuable about us deciding not to tolerate this anymore.
I do think it's valuable too. And I will say that I have not heard about as many men losing their jobs these days as there for a while when the Me Too movement was very, very intense. I think that there has begun to be a balance, perhaps. Whoops, I lost your body. And the,
Am I there? I can't see the picture.
There you are, Susie.
Okay.
So the balance, I think, is coming back a little bit to where it's not like a ferocious shark attack. But I totally believe in the Me Too movement. I totally believe that women should be treated equally in the job and not given a job because they are not allowing sex or something. But on the other hand, I did feel that it was important we find that balance. Like the woman that wore the long dresses and decided that the pantaloons in the job force, wearing it when they were speaking, was taking the message away. You know, there comes where we're talking about priorities. Priorities to me begin to be, there's that stage where priorities are about shouting and screaming and enforcing, and then there's the point where it takes a softer tone and it becomes more acceptable to everybody, kind of like wearing the dresses when it was time to speak about the message of the higher priority.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Like I said, just because you're right about something doesn't mean that that's the battle to fight. You've got to choose your battles.
As a phone counselor or as a reader, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. You can say the things that are important in a soft tone or in a way that is compassionate, or you can shout it and make people close their ears. People will close their ears if it's shouted. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it depends. There are some cases I think where shouting is appropriate. For a long time, women weren't allowed to have emotions. And still, that's often the case. For me, I often prefer a soft answer turneth away wrath kind of a philosophy. But that said, I've had people say, oh, feminists are all angry, and what are you going to do about that? How can you make them be nicer and be less angry? Well, first of all, we're not all angry.
No.
Secondly, I think it's interesting that people are concerned about women's righteous indignation about this kind of anger when, if you look at the statistics, statistically, men are much more likely than women to perform violent crimes. Women are much more likely than men to die at the hand of their domestic partner. So if you look at the stats, men in general are more likely to have an anger issue that is really a problem. And so I think we need to think about, why are we so concerned about women's anger? Why aren't we looking at what's really happening out there, what the numbers say, and addressing the bigger problem?
Oh, I believe that the anger is important. All I'm saying is that sometimes, like a politician who shouts their message, or a politician who keeps a civil tone, which one are people more likely to listen to?
Right,
Whether male or female. How should modern activists emulate suffragists, or is that what we're just talking about? What pitfalls should they avoid, or is that what we are talking about?
We are talking about those things. But one of the things that I think we haven't mentioned yet, that I think is a way that we should emulate the original suffragists, is that they reached out to each other, and they worked with people who weren't necessarily like them and who didn't necessarily agree with them about everything, and they found ways to make it work. They really needed to do that because they were very much in the minority. My book is about the very beginning of the movement, when it was so rare to find anyone who thought that way, who thought that women should be equal with men. It was just a new idea. That if they found somebody who understood that principle and agreed with them, they needed to find a way to work with that person because there weren't that many others out there. And so they made it work. They found ways to build those bridges and to work together. And that's something I think we need to keep doing today. We need to find ways to build bridges, to talk to people that we don't necessarily agree with about everything, but find ways to work together, find ways to communicate and hear each other. And I think that's something we still need to do today. But also, when we talk about pitfalls, it was also a similar thing that was something of a pitfall. There was a point actually there were multiple points within the suffrage movement, where people who were both disadvantaged groups, who were both not being treated fairly under the law, started competing against each other for the rights they deserved. In particular, it became sort of a competition where activists who used to be working together, some of them really cared about black men getting the right to vote. Some of them really cared about white women getting the right to vote. Unfortunately, not enough of them cared about black women. But these two groups started competing against each other instead of competing against the laws that oppressed both of them. And I think that's something that is still a pitfall we run into today. Whenever we find ourselves trying to we should fight for our rights, but we should never fight for our rights at the expense of some other disadvantaged person or group. If we find ourselves in that position, we should probably look for another path.
April, do women like women?
Do women like other women?
Yeah, I mean, do you ever find that at times women seem to be supportive of each other, and yet at the same time can be almost sabotaging to other women? I think that I have seen that many times, where, for instance, a woman that tries to become an executive boss will find that her worst enemies are often other women. It isn't just men that seem to get angry about women who have a voice, but it seems as if women can be women's worst enemies at times. And I believe it happens not when we're fighting to help each other to survive. It happens when the survival has kicked in and the accomplishment has happened, and all of a sudden the women that we're wanting to protect and help and lift each other on the shoulders suddenly become bitter at the one that is winning. Do you ever find that happens in your world? I mean, I know it happens. I
Yeah.
see it all the time.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a human thing, that humans are naturally competitive. We have that fight or flight response.
For women to do it to women is for the same reasons we have been discussing, because it's been such a struggle and fight to gain the amount of recognition that they have. It is odd that at times, I will put it this way, I have noticed that sometimes in certain instances of tragedy and horrendous actions, the victim becomes like the person that was the abuser. Because, and I don't know why, because it happens. I see it happen where the victim who was going through such struggle, you would think would be the last person to become like the person that they were abused by. But I do see that it has happened to some women, that they have become so much empowered that they've become like the men's behavior towards other women that they were so against, were so traumatized by. So I'm not saying that happens all the time, but I'm just wondering, is that part of the equalization where at first you are downtrodden, then you are empowered, and then you have to find your balance? I'm just wondering, is that part of the whole thing? Is that part of where the priorities and where the pitfalls happen? The balance of going from one extreme to the other.
I would actually say that's another sign of patriarchy. Within the feminist movement, we talk about patriarchy a lot. A lot of people think that means we're talking about men, like patriarchy equals men, but that's not the case at all. Patriarchy is a system of power in which both men and women participate. It's a system of power which rewards men just for being men. It also rewards certain women for supporting men or for managing to, find their way around through the system and to figure out a way to get through and to push through the system. So what happens when you're in a patriarchal society is that sometimes women who are in some way benefiting from that patriarchal society will participate with men in holding other women down. It's not just men who do this. And so I think things like that are a symptom that we still have a little further to go before we've completely achieved equality.
And I look at it like a tornado. A tornado is created because the cold air and the hot air has to balance itself out. And when everything becomes equally distributed, then all of a sudden the tornado stops happening. So my feeling is that there is a balance of when disaster is met by empowerment, there has to find the people have to get used to what it feels like to be equal. And I think that you're right. You're absolutely right. I have one more question before we go. How old were you when you first became so impassioned with all of this? Tell me what happened in your life to impassion you.
Well, I would say that a lot of little things happened, not one particular moment. But as I grew up, there were different things that happened. When I was 12 and the boys around me were ordained to the priesthood and I wasn't, that was probably one of the very first things. As I got older and I saw boys receiving certain privileges that girls couldn't, that also affected me. When I had children and I started caring about what kind of a world they were going to grow up in, So there wasn't really one moment, but I didn't actually become involved in activism until I was an adult in my mid-30s with children. And
All right. I hate to say it,
yeah,
April,
it took a
but
while.
our music is starting. Tell me one thing you know for sure.
I know that we are all equals, even if we're not treated that way.
All right. Thank you, April. It was great having you.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Psychic radio, holistic radio, spiritual radio. This is achieveradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/achieveradio.
Hi, I'm Anne Marie Odell.